The basic burden an economist holds on to is disappointment. We spend our lives studying the ways to make the best use of scarce resources, and then we look out in the world and we see people not doing it. Now, it could be that we're wrong about people being rational, but more likely it's that people are being rational in a way that is a little unexpected. What makes sense from the perspective of an economist might not be what makes sense from the perspective of a politician. So in this lecture we're going to dig into that, and we're going to see exactly why it might be the case that a rational politician or a rational political decision maker besides a politician will be making decisions that fly in the face of economics, not because economics is wrong, but because from their particular perspective, they are doing the thing that is rational given the choices that they have available to them. Now, what we've seen by this point, we've seen a little less of this stuff in the macro class. In micro classes, we've dug into this a lot more. But we've seen that there are a lot of inefficient policies like price controls. We've dug into why those policies are inefficient, again, in micro, not so much in macro. And we've seen some really good policies that aren't being used, like taxing pollution. So it's possible politicians are stupid, irrational, and evil. It's certainly tempting to use that explanation, but it's not a good explanation, and it doesn't give us a way to actually solve the problem. Economics gives us a better explanation, which is that the rationale of a behavior depends on context. So when we see someone do something that looks stupid, we have to ask, not just is this person stupid, but what is the specific set of decisions that they get to make, and what sort of outcomes do they get from those different decisions? So, something to pause and reflect here. Who should we expect to act in their own self-interest? Right? This is like chapter 1 stuff. What does it mean to be rationally self-interested? Well, we know that when we go out into the world, we behave in our own self-interest. When we go to the grocery store, right, we buy the best quality at the best price when that's an option. Certainly our neighbors, family, and friends are going to behave like that when they're out in the market. Do they behave in their self-interest when they're interacting with us? Maybe, right? This is something where, again, context matters. The way you interact with your family is obviously very different than the way you interact with strangers. So self-interest there becomes a little bit fuzzier, right? Your parents do all kinds of things that harm their well-being for your benefit. Is that them acting in their self-interest, or is their self-interest, does it include your well-being? Corporate executives, there we certainly expect them to act in their self-interest. And a big lesson from economics is that we want to make sure we get the rules of society right so that people like corporate executives, in acting in their self-interest, are also promoting social well-being. We want them to get rich by making your lives better, not by making your lives worse. And of course, politicians, this is where things get really weird, because economics, up until, say, the middle of the 20th century, we often did things like propose expansionary policy during a recession because that will be the thing that addresses the problem that we're looking at. But it overlooks the fact that politicians might not have incentives to do good economic policy. They might get more votes or secure their position against competitors by doing things that economists would not recommend that they do. So, a normal principles of econ class, we spend quite a bit of time on market failure. Right? 9 times out of 10, self-interest does work really nicely, but sometimes we have these situations where following your rational self-interest leads to not the nice invisible hand story, but to an outcome where I pursue my interest, I make myself better, and I harm other people, right? Sometimes we get that invisible hand story, but with market failures, sometimes we don't. Right? Sometimes we have something where I can push costs onto other people, and the result is rational self-interest could lead to a socially suboptimal outcome. Now, the big insight of public choice theory, which starts to show up in the 1950s and really gets developed through the 60s and 70s and is still an ongoing research program, is recognizing that we can have market failure and government failure. Right? So government can fix a lot of market failure problems, but we have to ask the question, will they? What incentives are at play? So for example, let's say we're looking at the issue of public goods, the free rider problem. So if an asteroid is coming towards Earth, we want to deflect that so that we don't all die. But the free rider problem tells us that we should expect people to not contribute enough to this public good, and so it might not happen at all, and so we might need the government to step in to force people to pay for this. Because if you asked me voluntarily to pay for this asteroid defense program, I know that if I don't pay and you deflect the asteroid, I get saved and I get to keep extra money. Right? So maybe you have to force me to pay this, to pay some tax for this in order to overcome this. But we have to ask the question of what sort of incentives are involved, which means we're applying the economic way of thinking to the decisions of political actors, right? Whether that's politicians or bureaucrats or voters, we're going to see economic reasoning all over the place. So the big things that we're going to look at here, these are going to be the places where you might want to pause, ponder on the things that we've covered, update your notes as we're going along. But the four big areas we're going to see: rational ignorance, and with that we're going to see the prisoner's dilemma, which lays out the basic logic of a lot of situations where we get market failures or government failures. Situations where I do what's good for me but bad for us. A specific application of that is the idea of rent seeking. So rent seeking is when we do things that advance our goals, but in the process we're using up resources. So the net effect is at the very least ambiguous. But in the cases we're going to talk about here, we're looking at negative sum games, right? Something where through the act of rent seeking, we start with a big pie, but we end up with a smaller pie. We end up with fewer resources as a society than we started with. I get a bigger slice of that pie if I'm a successful rent seeker, but I get a bigger slice of a smaller pie. Society overall is poorer, right? So this is going to be a big economic question of how do we reduce that problem. That an expansion on that idea is the idea of concentrated benefits and dispersed costs. So I might have something I want to engage in rent seeking for, like say subsidies to the higher ed industry. Right? That means that I get more money. That means that you pay less out of pocket for tuition. You and I are happy, but everyone who's not in our industry, the regular taxpayers who graduated a long time ago, or the trade workers who aren't going to college, they're picking up the tab for us, right? They're facing the costs. We're getting big benefits from this. So that in and of itself is an example of rent seeking. But when we do this for this industry and another industry does their own version and we get a whole bunch of this, we end up in a real tragedy of the commons again, right? We end up with sort of piling on this same fundamental logic, but in a big way. And when we see that in politics, this is the basic logic underlying special interest groups, right? This is going to tell us why special interest groups are so successful and why they are also so harmful to the economy. And finally, a little bit about my incentives as someone who works for the State University of New York as a bureaucrat. The logic of economic decision-making within a bureaucracy leads to interesting economic outcomes. Now, that doesn't mean that, well, basically bureaucracies come with costs and benefits, right? It might be the case that the benefits outweigh the costs, but we have to understand the underlying logic in order to try and avoid getting more harm than good. All right, so let's jump right into it with rational ignorance. Why are voters so awful? Now, this section is going to be a little bit longer than the other ones, so brace yourself. But like I said, at the end, pause. At the end of the section, pause and digest. Work on your notes with this. Start asking questions over on the class Discord. So, rational ignorance. Now, this looks like a contradiction in terms. How can it be rational to be ignorant? And yet, we can really easily see that people are definitely ignorant of a lot of political questions. Right? Politicians spend a ton of money and effort making sure that we know who they are, and yet we still don't. Right? So, who are your local reps? See if you can identify who occupies these offices. Ask your friends, ask your family. Some of them are going to be easy, right? Who's the governor? Even I know that. Congressperson, I know who my congressperson is, but I certainly don't know who my state senator is. I don't know my city council people. These are offices making important decisions, and yet most of us are ignorant of a lot of them. Right? The highest profile we tend to know, but congresspeople, I know my congressperson, I could maybe guess 5 people in Congress right now across the country besides my own congressperson. I only know my congressperson because I voted against them in the last election. So, how can it be rational to be ignorant? Now, a really nice example of this from my past, I highly recommend, look up on YouTube, Talking to Americans. This was a segment from This Hour Has 22 Minutes. This was like the Canadian version of The Daily Show back when I was a kid. I think it might have been on before The Daily Show. So Rick Mercer would go to America and he would ask them these absurd questions about Canada. So here he is talking to then Governor of Arkansas, Mike Huckabee, telling Mike Huckabee that Canada has just preserved our national igloo. Now, there's no such thing as the national igloo of Canada, but if you're Mike Huckabee, you have no real reason to know whether or not Canada has a national igloo. So the whole premise of the show is that Canadians get to laugh at Americans and their ignorance of Canada. But it's not so wild for Americans to be ignorant of Canada, because why do you need to be ignorant of Canada? Right? So the big lesson here is learning is costly. There are a lot of things that we might learn about, but we just can't learn all of them. Right? So I don't know who my state senator is. I also don't know how my computer works. Right? That is a specialized body of knowledge that some people have that I don't need to have. Right? So I still get the benefits of a functioning computer even though I'm ignorant. And what that gives me is more time to learn other things. Right? So I've invested a lot of time into learning about economics. I've specialized my knowledge in that. And the flip side is I have specialized in being ignorant about things like how my computer works, how my car works, any number of other things. There are a surprising amount of things that I'm ignorant of, and this big intricate body of knowledge that makes the whole world work, and I have just a tiny slice of the whole thing. But that's how a modern economy works. It's division of labor, it's specialization, right? And again, the rationality part of this is just costs and benefits. What's the marginal cost of learning more? Well, it means giving up opportunities to do something else. What are the marginal benefits? Well, if they're lower than the marginal costs, then it doesn't make sense to learn that thing. So if we think about being an informed voter, right? So not just knowing who's running for office, but what effects the policies will have. That takes an incredible amount of information and background and understanding. If you're going to try to be a perfectly informed voter, you would need 100 PhDs in economics, sociology, history, poli-sci, chemistry, physics, all these different things you'd need to know about. It would be impossible to be perfectly informed. right? So we're out of the realm of being informed or uninformed and into the realm of marginal decisions. Will I be more informed or less informed? What things will I be ignorant about? So personally, I tried to avoid spending too much of my effort keeping up with the news because that's knowledge that becomes obsolete right away. I focus on building up my understanding of economics, and I kind of have a shortfall in my understanding of, say, history. Right? I have to navigate these trade-offs as best I can, but I am definitely in a situation where I am facing costs and benefits, and the net effect is I am going to be more uninformed than I am informed. Now, the benefits of being informed, one is the consequence to the outcomes, and I'm missing a point here, but that might be something like voting for a candidate who's going to have good policies, right? A candidate who understands the benefits of international trade, someone who understands the benefits of certain scientific approaches to things, someone who understands any number of different things, right? We want informed voters because that gets us more informed outcomes. It gets us the outcomes of informed voters rather than the outcomes that we get from ignorant voters. Another benefit we get from being informed is you don't look like an idiot, right? So you're talking to people, and if people expect you to be informed about these things and they say, hey, did you hear what the governor said, and you didn't, maybe that makes you look bad in your social circle, right? So that's a small place where you're getting some immediate benefit. But this first one, the actual outcome, that leads us into the slightly weird place. So let's talk about a little mathematical tool to help us with this. The idea of an expected benefit or an expected value or an expected cost. When we say expected blank in economics, what we mean is a probability weighted average. So let's start with a really simple version. Let's say we're playing a dice game, right? So we play a game of dice. I've got 10 dice here, and maybe the game is I roll all 10 dice, and if I get 1/6, then I lose $1, and if not, then I gain $1. Right? Something like that. We can make up any number of games, and then we can say, well, what's the probability that we see a 6? What's the probability we don't see a 6? And then we can use those probabilities to change or to add up the different outcomes. A really easy example would be, say, roulette. So you might bet on red. You put $10 on red. What's the probability that you get red? It's a little bit less than 50%. Right? A standard roulette wheel has half red, half black, and then those two green squares. So actually it's not half black and half red. I think it's like 48%. So you have about a 48% chance that you get red and a 52% chance that you don't get red. Let's simplify for a second. Let's just say it was 50-50. So you pay $10. If it comes up red, you get paid $20. If it comes up black, you get $0. What's the expected benefit? 50% times 20 is 10, plus 50% times 0 is 0. So we get $10 plus 0. Our expected benefit is $10. We bet $10, and on average, we get $10 back. Right? Now we throw those green squares back on the roulette wheel. We get the 0 and the double 0. Now what that means is we bet $10. So now we're going to have $20 times a little less than 50%. So we're going to get something like $9.50 is the value of this term here. This is still 52% times 0 is 0. So we get 0 plus, let's call it $9.50. The expected benefit of a $10 bet on red is $9.50. We give up $10, we get back $9.50. We're 50 cents poorer. This is the basic business model of a casino, right? This is how the casino works. But the basic logic is useful for a lot of things. So if we think about what's the expected benefit to voting, right? To being an informed voter especially, but to voting in general. So I vote for some candidate. What is the benefit of our possible outcomes? Well, let's start here. What are our possible outcomes? maybe my candidate wins, maybe my candidate loses, right? So I vote because I hope that'll increase the probability that my candidate wins and reduce the probability that my candidate loses. But by how much, right? What is the probability that my vote changes the outcome? Well, bad news, the probability is very, very low for any large election. And by large, I mean more than about 5,000 voters. If you're voting for student government, your vote has a non-negligible chance of affecting the election. But the presidential election, especially for us in New York, but even for an individual living in a swing state, the probability of changing the outcome is astronomically small, right? So even if your candidate's really good, when we bring in the probability and we calculate an expected benefit, what we're going to find is that you're not getting a whole lot. And then we add to that the fact that maybe your candidate's really good for the country, but you're 1/300 millionth of the country, so your share of that benefit is small. That basic logic leads to big problems in terms of how effective a democracy will be at achieving good outcomes. Now, of course, the alternative is a whole lot worse, but we still have these problems. So first problem is your vote isn't going to change the outcome with more than 1 in a billion probability, right? Very, very small chance that you change the outcome, and the benefits that you do get from being informed are mostly going to other people, right? So I vote for a candidate who isn't absolutely terrible, and that's nice for me and it's nice for everyone else, right? But everyone else getting those benefits doesn't give me a strong incentive to be informed. So let's contrast this with another decision, right? So I recently ordered a new phone. I spent a small amount of time researching which phone to get, but all the time I put into deciding which phone to get is decisive, right? So if you're in the market for a new phone and you spend an extra hour studying the options, that extra hour is going to lead to you having better information and avoiding making a mistake. But when we're thinking about who to vote for, the probability that my vote changes the outcome is basically zero. So it doesn't make sense for me to spend a lot of time deciding who to vote for, but it does make sense for me to spend more time deciding which phone to buy or which car to buy. When I am a consumer making a decision that's only going to affect me, this probability, this is the probability of information leading you to a better outcome. This probability is going to be a high number. When we're dealing with society at large and we're dealing with voting, the decision, the probability that the one decision maker, that you specifically affect the outcome, is basically zero. Large benefits, right? But a big number times zero is zero. So the good news and the bad news of voting. And I've done a separate video on this, so I'll do this version quick. Your vote doesn't matter on the margin. But the good news is your vote does matter on average, right? So the good news is because your vote isn't going to change the outcome of the election, this election, you should never vote for the lesser of two evils. You should always vote for the candidate that you think is genuinely best. When you're voting, don't think about what happens in the election you're voting in. Think about what happens in the next election, right? And in the next election, your vote this election has some impact on what sort of decisions politicians will make. If they know that they lost your vote last time, they're going to try and get your vote the next time. So, our example, and again, check out the other video to dig into this in more depth, but imagine we've got three candidates, A, B, and C. A is better than B, B is better than C, but A is not going to win, right? A is some third-party candidate. The classic advice here is if you vote for A, you're wasting your vote. But what we know from this expected benefit logic is that you've already wasted your vote, because your probability is so low, the time you're voting is time that you are not doing your civic duty of, say, writing letters to the editor. The time you spend voting is taking time away from doing things like raising your children to be better citizens, right? When you're voting, you're doing something that has very, very little direct impact. And when I say very little, I mean astronomically little. So, yeah, maybe C is terrible and B is better, but it's not going to matter, right? Our basic outcomes are going to be maybe B wins by a bunch, maybe C wins by a bunch, but it's not going to be C wins by one. If C won by one vote, you'd feel really bad for voting for A. I can't guarantee that C never wins by one vote, but I would put a lot of money on the notion that C is not going to win by just one vote. Even if you take a look at the closest election in my lifetime, George W. Bush in the 2000 election, it came down to one district, and I think it was something like 300 to 900 votes. It was a few hundred votes in one particular place. If you didn't live in that particular place, your vote didn't really matter. If you lived in that place, you still needed to change 1,000 votes to change the outcome. I don't get to vote 1,000 times. I get to vote once. Given that, if I was in that district and I knew that it was going to come down to that district, I would still have incentive to vote for A if I thought that George W. Bush and Al Gore were whichever of these two candidates, right? Even in that situation where it's really close and the stakes are high, because you are one individual making one decision about one vote, you should vote with your conscience, not try to vote strategically. So, since you're not going to change the outcome of the election, effectively your vote is free. Voting for B, in that case, is a missed opportunity to tell future candidates to be more like candidate A. Vote doesn't matter on the margin, but it does matter on average. Now, let's stretch out this logic. Let's lay it all out here. We're doing kind of some light-duty game theory here. Now, game theory is essentially economics when we're dealing with two people interacting where each person's decision affects the other person's outcome. I should say two or more people. So if we think about voting, the outcome depends on my vote plus your vote plus everyone else's vote. So let's just think about this decision of, do I spend 100 hours researching who to vote for, or do I spend 0 hours? What outcomes do we get? Well, if I and everyone else spend 100 hours researching, we're going to get good outcomes, and we're going to get representative accountability. We're going to have sort of this ideal civics textbook version of a democracy, right? We're getting exactly what we want to see happen. This is our good square. Now, I can't tell everyone else what to think, but I do get to ask, what do I do if I think that everyone else is going to be more informed? Right? So if I decide then to be less informed, I still get that good outcome, right? If I'm the one ignorant voter, we're going to have good politicians, they're going to have good policies, they're going to be held accountable, and I'm going to be able to spend more time on the things that I want. Right? So I can play PlayStation. I can learn skills that I get paid for. I can spend time with family. I get the good outcomes, plus I get more stuff. It is irrational for me to go to this top square when this bottom square is available. Right? So what do we expect me to do? We expect me to be uninformed if I think that everyone else is going to be informed. Now, the trouble is everyone else has the same logic. Everyone else is in the same situation. So if everyone else is trying to spend more time with family or more time making money or more time at leisure, then we end up in this column instead, where everybody else is uninformed. So what about if I decide to be informed in that case? Well, it's not enough. We still get the bad outcomes. And in this case, things are going to be even worse, right? Because it's no longer politicians competing to get votes from informed voters. Politicians competing to get votes from uninformed voters. That's why we get the crap that we get in this country, right? And it's not just our country. Other countries have the same problem. We fundamentally, because of the issue of rational ignorance, have a lot of uninformed voters. We have politicians seeking votes from those uninformed voters. And the way you get the votes of uninformed voters isn't arguing about good policy. It's trying to get attention. It's trying to convince people that the other guy's a schmuck. It's trying to look good. It's trying to be all glitter and no substance. Demagoguery, waste, and rent-seeking and special interest stuff that we're going to see in a few more slides. We're going to get bad outcomes. If everyone's uninformed and I'm also uninformed, we get those bad outcomes, but at least I get to spend more time with my family, right? We at least offset some of those bad outcomes, those bad public outcomes, with some good private outcomes, right? So this is where we end up. It's not a good place to be, but it's where we are. So this is essentially the prisoner's dilemma. Right, so let me make this a little bit more abstract, introduce you to sort of, well, not the boy meets girl of economic storytelling, but very close. So economics, with always telling stories, our version of boy meets girl is gains from trade. There's this hypothesis that there's only like 20 different stories that can be told, and every single story is a variation of one of these, right? So a really popular story in movies is boy meets girl, right? Two young people meet and fall in love, and one of them does something stupid, they overcome that, and that's the story, right? That's the whole plot to most rom-coms. In economics, our version of boy meets girl, the nice story with a happy ending, is gains from trade. There's a little bit of adjustment, re-equilibration, and then we end up with everyone happy. Prisoner's Dilemma is like our King Lear, right? It's another big popular story, but this is the one with the sad ending. So with the Prisoner's Dilemma, we're all the protagonist, and our tragic flaw is that we do the thing that makes sense for us, and we end up with a worse outcome collectively. Prisoner's Dilemma is just one famous game in game theory. There are many others. I highly encourage you to check out Game Theory 101. It's a great YouTube resource for learning some basic game theory. But Prisoner's Dilemma is a popular story because it really strips down the bare logic that captures a lot of the sorts of problems we'll see. One version that you'll have seen was on the midterm. I call this question 0 because a million years ago, when we used to have school in person, I would always have this in the written portion as question 0. So here you have the option to ask for more extra credit for yourself, and as long as not too many people do that, you get the extra credit. But if too many people choose too much extra credit, nobody gets anything, right? This is like if we all try to pull too many fish out of the ocean, eventually there's no more fish. If we all pull a small amount of fish, then it's not that big a deal if one person pulls out too many, right? Same basic logic, and we can see this logic in this table. We're going to see this in this table in a second, but let me tell the classic story to lay the groundwork. And let me also add a caveat that we're going to put these numbers in terms of punishment, but what they should represent is utility. We'll come to that in a second. So, the police pick up two people for a recent robbery, and they try to get a confession out of them. Now, in this context, right, from society's perspective as a whole, we of course want to discourage robbery, right? So from society's perspective, these prisoners falling for the prisoner's dilemma is a good thing. It's exactly what we want. But from their perspective, the perspective of the prisoners themselves, they're going to run into this basic problem that we're talking about. So the police take these two suspects, they put them into separate interrogation cells, and they try and get a confession because they don't have enough evidence, right? So they can give some trumped up charges like loitering or something, but if they can get a confession, their job's going to be a lot easier, and they're going to be able to put away at least one of these criminals they're going to be able to throw the book at them. So to each suspect, they offer this deal. If you confess, we'll blame it on the other guy. You get to go free. If you keep your mouth shut and the other guy also keeps his mouth shut, we're going to give you some trumped up charges. You're going to have to do a whole bunch of community service. If you both confess, we're not going to necessarily throw the book at you, but you are both going to go to jail for armed robbery or whatever the charge is. So each player has these two options: confess or keep quiet. And before I jump into this, let me just also add a little bit of an extra layer of complexity here. This is what we call a one-shot game, right? So the logic we're looking at here is really abstracted. In reality, if you are knocking over a liquor store, you're probably doing it with someone you know. And so in that case, you're not just worried about the punishment for this, but you're worried about retaliation. You're worried about your ability to engage in more crimes in the future. But that's a whole different topic we can talk about some other place. Let's start with the simple version. So, if I'm player 1 and you're player 2, I want to ask, what should I do if I think you're going to confess, and what should I do if I think you're going to keep quiet? My payoffs are in purple, and I want higher payoffs. So if I think you're going to confess, I'm choosing between -10 and -15. I would rather have -10. Right? So this is the equivalent of, I keep my mouth shut, you confess, they throw the book at me, maybe I do 15 years in prison and you do 0 years. Right? So if I think we're going to be in that box, I want to confess really quickly while I still can, then I only get 10 years punishment, you get 10 years punishment. Of course, collectively we're doing 20 years instead of 15, which is a lot harder, right? It means more punishment. So for us, this is a bad outcome, but for me, this is a good outcome. It is individually rational for me to confess if I think that you're going to confess. If I think that you're going to keep quiet, maybe I do 2 years if I keep quiet and 0 years if I confess. 0 is better than -2. So no matter what you do, I have incentive to confess. Right? And likewise, you're looking at -10 versus 15, you want to confess. -2 versus 0, you want to confess. So everything pulls us into this box. Right? I only get to decide, do I confess or keep quiet? Which row do we go in? You decide which column we end up in. And when we do what makes sense for us individually, we end up in this square, even though we would both prefer to be in this square, if only we could find a way to get there. We could get there if we could change the rules of the game, if we could make our decisions in the same interrogation cell instead of in separate interrogation cells. But given the structure of the game, we end up here instead. Now again, let me come back to this caveat. We're talking about utility, right? So this isn't necessarily years in jail. This is suffering from punishment. This is suffering from lawyers' fees. This is guilt. This is fear of retaliation. This is lost opportunity to rob stores in the future. This is an all-encompassing number that captures all of the good and bad things about all the outcomes. Right? So when we're telling this story, -10, this isn't 10 years of punishment and I worry that you're going to shank me in prison. This is just -10 units of disutility versus -15. Right? So this includes fear and cost and everything else. So given all that, the logic of the prisoner's dilemma, where I decide the row, you decide the column, we do what makes sense for each of us individually, and we end up doing what makes the least sense for us collectively, right? We would like to be over here. So, just like I said, player 2, if they're going to confess, player 1 wants to confess. If player 2 is going to keep quiet, player 1 wants to confess. Player 2 also always wants to confess. They do what makes sense, what is rational, but what's rational for each individual decision maker is collectively irrational, right? In the same way, you look at basically everything that goes on when you're driving on the LIE. I cut you off, I get home 5 seconds faster, right? But I slow down everyone behind me by 15 seconds times 100 people. And then someone else cuts me off and someone cuts that person off, and we keep cutting each other off. we're doing the equivalent of constantly doing the uncooperative thing, uncooperative between player 1 and player 2, right? Not cooperative with the police. But when we do this thing that is uncooperative, we end up collectively worse off, right? One little thing that maybe makes me a little bit better off makes us worse off, and especially when we all do it. So, this logic, it applies to rational ignorance. It applies to pollution. It's the general story of the tragedy of the commons, right? I put pollution into the air when I drive my car. I pull fish out of the ocean when I'm pulling my trawler through the ocean to try and make a living in rush hour traffic, not leaving a big enough buffer zone, not cutting people off. The last couple of weeks, people have been cutting me off from the shoulder. It's absolutely nuts. It's a tragedy of the common situation. How do we address this? That's a whole nother issue, right? But by understanding the basic logic, that lets us ask the question of how do we go back and change these payoffs or change the rules of the game to encourage us to end up down here rather than up here. Now, really interesting variation on this. Look this up on YouTube also, or Wikipedia, the idea of rational irrationality. So we can take this logic of rational ignorance and we can apply it to the question of irrationality too, right? We can sort of do a meta-analysis. So what does it take to be rational? This goes back to the question of what's the deal with human beings in the context of evolution? We got these big dolphin brains that eat a ton of calories and are incredibly difficult to maintain when lions are trying to eat you on the savannah, right? It's not so hard in a modern human society where you can go to Burger King, but 100,000 years ago, right, it was a difficult thing. Having the equipment to think rationally is difficult. Thinking rationally is not something that comes naturally to people, right? We have a tendency to kind of err towards irrationality. So we can think, well, when do we actually go through the effort to do the hard work of thinking clearly about things? Well, it's going to be when the stakes are high. And the flip side of that is when the stakes are low, maybe it's not a big deal, right? So if you read your horoscope, yeah, it's irrational, but does it really matter? No, not really. So if it makes you feel good, then it's perfectly rational to do that irrational thing, right? If it's part of your routine, if it's part of how you get ready for the day, if it makes you feel good at all, the costs are so low that it's perfectly rational to have an irrational belief that it's a good idea to read your horoscope. But if we're thinking about gravity, well, suddenly things change a lot. So with gravity, first off, we have much higher costs of irrational views. Second, we have much faster feedback mechanisms, right? So when you step off the third floor balcony, first off, it hurts, and second off, you learn quick, right? Or you don't learn and you're just no longer part of the population of people who we ask, do you believe in gravity? We compare that to something like, what's the appropriate healthcare policy? In that case, the feedback mechanism is a lot more difficult, right? You step off a balcony, you fall, it's pretty easy to say, gravity hurt you, don't do that. You have bad healthcare policy, like, for example, every single country in the world, every single country in the world has an imperfect healthcare plan. They just have different problems. But you say, all right, we're going to go from here to this. We're going to make a healthcare industry that lines up along these ways. We're going to have a healthcare finance industry that follows these rules. And then it's going to take a generation before you even have the information to evaluate how good a policy was that. Right? But even if it doesn't come out the way you thought it was, you're still going to argue, well, my idea was still good. What really was wrong was this other thing happened, right? There was some change in some other policy besides healthcare that ruined my plans. And you're always going to be able to make those sorts of arguments, right? When we're dealing with big, complex political issues, that feedback mechanism is not as direct as something like gravity. If you try something bad, you aren't necessarily going to learn your lesson. So it's a complex system, so you just can't learn from direct experience, right? Plus, as an individual voter, you can have irrational views about who to vote for, but because it's not directly affecting the outcome, the costs of holding those irrational views are really, really low, right? We might be worried about, say, how do flat earthers affect political support for NASA, right? We might be worried about the voting bloc, right? But for you as an individual, the costs to you as an individual are relatively low. So if all your friends and family are flat earthers, the cost of breaking with that is social ostracism. That's a really steep cost to get a more rational vote. So from your perspective, this hypothetical voter whose friends are all flat earthers, it would be irrational to hold rational views. The costs of those rational views would be too high to the individual relative to the benefits. Right? We pick up irrational views from our friends and family all the time, right? This is how we pass on superstitions. But we have this overall story of when the direct costs are low and when the feedback loops are difficult, when they're diffuse and hard to learn from, we should expect to see more irrational views. We should expect people to be very rational when it comes to decisions like, does gravity exist? Or how do you conserve gas when driving your car? But we should not expect as much rationality when we're thinking about the views people hold regarding complex political decisions. So, big story. It's the flip side of the division of labor. Right? Rational ignorance is something that sounds weird, but really it's something that is a cornerstone of economic thinking. I don't know how to fix my car, and that's a good thing. My mechanic knows how to fix my car, but they don't know how to teach an economics class. They know more, they focus on one thing, they're able to know much more than we all could if we all had to fix our own cars. The result is cars can become more complicated. Since I don't have to fix my own car, only a professional is going to fix my car. The car can be more complicated so that maybe it gets better gas mileage or better safety or whatever else, right? Or it's cheaper to make, right? Maybe it's harder to maintain but cheaper to build, but that works in a modern society, right? I don't know, right? You'd have to ask someone who deals with the economics of car design, but the basic logic is there, right? We are rationally ignorant of things because we specialize, right? We are rationally informed about a small set of things and rationally ignorant about everything else. In collective decision-making situations, this leads to a problem. We want other voters to be informed, even though it would be irrational for them to do so. So politically, our big question is, how do we design a political system where rational ignorance doesn't turn out to be a problem? I don't have a nice, easy answer for you, but I do want to plant that question in your head as something to think about for the next 50 years. And this famous quote from mathematician Alfred North Whitehead, civilization advances by extending the number of important operations which we can perform without thinking of them, right? We go through our lives doing so many things without even being aware of them. Remember the iPencil video. How many things there are involved in getting a simple thing into your hands that you have no idea about, right? It's cool to see how much knowledge is there, but as much as we might appreciate it, the fact of the matter is civilization advances by you not knowing them, by not needing to know them. Check out on YouTube Primitive Technology, and you will see how much knowledge it took to be a human being 20,000 years ago. Hunter-gatherers were incredibly smart, but they knew a lot about a lot of things. We, in 2021, know way more about fewer things as individuals, And as a result, as a society, we know significantly more about significantly more things. Right? 20,000 years ago, you needed to know how to build a furnace to make clay or to make pottery. Right? And that's really cool, but in a society where everyone knows how to make their own clay pots, nobody's learning how to make chemotherapy drugs. All right, so rational ignorance gives us this explanation. When the costs of gaining knowledge are high relative to the benefits, it is rational to be ignorant. Not a big problem most of the time, but in politics it can be a serious problem. All right, pause, think about that, update your notes, and let's come into rent seeking. Now, this is a funny bit of terminology. In economics, rent is basically a term for an unearned pile of bonus money. The technical definition is a payment to bring some factor into the market above what is necessary to bring that factor into the market. So if we think about how much might I be willing to accept as income to do my job versus how much money do I actually get paid? Well, I get paid more than it would take to get me to keep coming to work. Right? So to that extent, I'm getting producer surplus, or we could think about that as a rent. Now, if I have my union work hard to raise my income even more, my union is seeking rents for me. Right? They are putting in effort to try to get more of that bonus for me. And that's good for me, but not necessarily good for society. So let's illustrate this with a hypothetical example. This is from my undergrad macro professor, Professor Hummel at San Jose State. He gives the example of the paper bike lock. So imagine you take your bike to school and your lock is a post-it note that says locked. Right? So you get to school, you put this post-it note on, you write locked, and I'm going to go try and steal your bike. So if I steal your bike, you're poorer by a bike, I'm richer by a bike. Society has +1, -1 bike is no change in bikes. Right? So that's no problem for society if I steal your bike, but obviously a problem for you. So you lock your bike. You put on this paper bike lock. I find your bike, I find this lock, and I say, damn, I can't get this lock anymore. Or sorry, I can't get this bike anymore. So your bike is safe, and now I gotta go do something else. I gotta find some other way to get my hands on a bike. So what happens if I then go take night classes at the Locksmith Academy? Right? From an economic perspective, what that means is I am using scarce time and effort in order to learn how to break your lock. Now, if I instead just go become a locksmith, then that's great. I'm providing a valuable service to people and I'm going to get paid for it. But if I'm only doing this to learn how to break your lock, the result is you lose a bike, I gain a bike. So we still see no net change, but I lost a night of my time in order to learn how to break this lock. Right? And then we have this issue of I do a thing, you're going to respond, I'm going to respond to that, and we're going to end up using more resources, and we're not going to end up with more bikes. Right? We're going to have less time and less resources. Society is going to be poorer in the long run, worse off in order for me to get your bike. So there's that opportunity cost of learning to spend time breaking the lock. So I steal your I steal your bike. You find your bike is missing. You get a new bike. This time you get a beefier lock. Right? Now, you still got a bike, or you got a new bike, right? So you missed out on the opportunity to spend your money somewhere else, right? Maybe you're just going to retire a month later, or whatever. You're going to retire, or you're going to give something up in order to get this new bike. Now you've got this new bike lock also, which means from society's perspective, there's steel in this bike lock that could have been going into making a car a little bit safer. Engineers are working for Master Lock instead of working for some other company. You have to carry a lock around. You're going to suffer some inconvenience. This happens to me all the time. I'll take my bike down to the library and then I'll realize I forgot my lock. I have to go home, get it, go back. There's a little bit of inconvenience from this whole deal with theft. Right? So from an economic perspective, theft is just a transfer. Right? I'm poor, you're richer, or vice versa. But it's what we do about theft where we see the problems. The effort thieves put into stealing and the effort property owners put into not being stolen from. If we could magically stop theft, society would be richer. Of course, we're not going to magically prevent theft, but it is worth acknowledging, and it's worth noting the nature of this economic harm. And this goes all the way back to the famous economics paper introducing the concept of rent-seeking by Gordon Tullock in 1967. I believe it was the welfare costs of monopoly, tariffs, and theft, something like that. And he gives this example of theft to motivate the larger idea of what's going on in a political setting. So Tullock was thinking about the issue of monopoly. And at the time, economists had looked at the problem of monopoly and said, how big is the deadweight loss? And the answer they came up with is, it's not huge, right? It's not a ton of money that the monopoly is causing directly. But Tullock said you're missing something. And that is, if I get a monopoly that makes me $1 billion, I'm willing to use $1 billion worth of resources to get that monopoly, right? So if I spend $500 million worth of paperwork, lawyer time, advertising time, all this time trying to secure, let's say, Cablevision's monopoly over cable TV in Suffolk County, that $500 million makes Cablevision poorer, right? But it's an investment that gets them $1 billion in the long run. So they're happy because they end up with an extra $500 million of profits. But from society's perspective, that $1 billion of profits, that value was going to be there anyways, right? It was just going to be there in the form of higher consumer surplus if there was going to be lower prices for cable. Instead, Cablevision captures that value, but they use resources to get it. So from society's perspective, instead of having $1 billion of consumer surplus, we get $500 million of producer surplus, right? And the result is we are poorer as a society, right? Now this slide, this is what I was saying at the beginning. Rent just means bonus money. Rent seeking is putting in the effort to try and get that bonus money. So where do we see this in markets? Well, companies can get money, or you can get rich, two basic ways: create value or capture value, make customers happy, or invest in anti-competitive regulations, right? In the first case, you say research how to get faster internet, right? Or how to get faster internet on existing wires, or whatever, right? Things that you invest in to make your customers happier. So cell phone makers are investing in better battery life. They invest in more responsive screens. They invest in chips that use less electricity. Those are things where efforts increase value and the world is better off. Cell phone companies will also invest in things like patent protection, things that make it harder for their competitors to make chips that save power and are more responsive. In that case, they are trying to capture value rather than create new value. That is rent seeking. So it's something that is good for the shareholders, but is more than offset by harms to society as a whole. Right? It's a prisoner's dilemma story again. So rent seeking, what we can expect is, this is like, you see this in ecosystems, right? If I look in my backyard, if I drop some food on my patio, the ants are going to come and get it, right? If there are calories to be had, eventually some animal is going to try and capture those calories. In an economy, if there's money to be made, we should expect that eventually someone catches on to that and tries to make that money. If they can make money by rent seeking, we should expect to see some amount of resource waste. Now, in this case, we do actually have an easier short answer to what do we do about this than we did with the problem of the prisoner's dilemma. Right? What we want to do is we want to make it harder to engage in rent seeking and easier to engage in that first way of making money by creating value. Right? And also, we should add, it's not just the rent seeking, but also the rent protection costing us money here. Right? So it sounds unfair, right? It sounds mean for me to say you bought a lock to protect your bike and you're making the economy poorer as a result. Right? Don't think of this as a moral judgment. Think of this purely from an economic perspective. You trying to protect your bicycle from my theft means society is poorer as a result. It's not that you did a bad thing, you did a perfectly sensible thing, but that the theft is there at all, that risk of theft is there, is the real problem. Right? So in a case like that, maybe what we want to do is, here's a bad example off the top of my head. Maybe we want to have just zero privacy and we've got CCTV everywhere. So if anyone steals anything, they get immediately arrested by violating all of our civil liberties and our right to privacy, just for the sake of argument, right? We could do something like that and we would save the resources that go into bicycle locks, right? Or say car theft. If you don't have to carry around keys because it's impossible for someone to get away with stealing your car, then your life is going to be a little bit more convenient. Right now, what way do we find to do that? Well, we're going to, as always, have to try and navigate some trade-offs. So giving up privacy to save having to carry a bike lock is probably a bad idea. But looking for ways to make the bike lock less important is certainly something that we're going to want to do, right? So you're going to do things like, say, leave your bike in the garage rather than leave it unlocked on your front lawn. Doing things that reduce your exposure to this sort of risk mean that hopefully you can find less resource-intensive ways to protect your rents rather than, say, hiring a full-time armed guard to stand with your bike day and night. Dealing with this problem from a social perspective, we want to do things like restrict the types of laws that can be passed. Constitutional restrictions are really helpful here. If we can restrict what sorts of laws can be passed that affect the value of assets and the scope of competition, then we change the nature of how companies seek profits. Right? So if it's easy for the government to pass a law that dramatically increases the value of some asset or decreases the value of some asset or makes it hard to compete, then we should worry about lobbyists trying to take advantage of that. We should worry about people seeking profit opportunities, essentially corrupting our political process in the same way that if I drop an apple on my back patio, I know that ants are going to show up. All right, another moment to pause, gather yourself, and then we'll come back into this. So if we think not just about, say, how do I engage in rent seeking? So we gave an example earlier. My union is constantly trying to do things like get more money from the state of New York. They're trying to do things to advance our special interests, trying to get more money for professors, trying to reduce competition from unaccredited schools, trying to do all these different things that help us. But those things are rent-seeking activities that are probably doing more harm than good from societal perspective, right? It's a net gain for me, but it's a net loss when we include not just me, but you and your grandparents and the people who aren't engaged in the higher ed industry, right? But all these other people have their own special interests. So when we all do this all together, we are robbing each other. And with all these negative sum games, we can end up much worse off. As an example, if we look at the American tax code, the American tax code is essentially a massive body of regulations so huge that nobody even knows how big it is. It's just a big giant quagmire of loopholes. It's loopholes for homeowners like me. I get my mortgage interest rate deduction. There are special loopholes for charities. There are special loopholes for energy companies. All these different exceptions and variations and all these different things. In order to sort that all out, one thing we could do is say, let's get rid of the mortgage interest rate deduction. Right? That's a good idea from an economic perspective. But homeowners are going to throw a fit. Right? So in order to get rid of that, you're also going to have to get rid of all of the other ones. If we could just clear it all out and start from a blank slate, we would be in a much better position societally. Right? It would be much better for your grandchildren. But it would be very disruptive to the lawyers and your parents and everyone engaged in economic activity now, the people navigating those loopholes. But those loopholes are the result of special interest groups. So, a classic example that you might not know about. If you look at the ingredients of on a bottle of Coca-Cola, you'll see high fructose corn syrup. This is something that only Americans do. Canadians and Mexicans both use real sugar in their Coca-Cola. You can find Mexican Coke at the Costco in Farmingdale. I've seen it. Consumers prefer cane sugar, right? It's a premium option now. People will go out of their way and they'll pay a little bit extra to get cane sugar. But if you're just getting something out of the vending machine, you're getting something with high fructose corn syrup. Why are we using high fructose corn syrup? It's an inferior product, and it's actually more expensive than sugar, which is why Canadians and Mexicans who are poorer than Americans use real sugar instead of high fructose corn syrup. Right? So why are richer American consumers using an inferior product? And the answer is special interests. And in this case, we have two special interest groups, corn growers and sugar growers. So the big one here, I'm going to focus on the sugar side. Corn, that's a whole giant mess of protectionism. There's a lot of really bad policy in the Farm Bill to try and promote growing corn for all kinds of terrible ideas, like the ethanol in our gasoline that takes as much energy to grow as it provides. But let's focus on sugar. With sugar, we have a very small number of sugar farmers in the American economy. And in fact, they're all kind of controlled by a very small group of people. If you look up the Fanjul family, you'll find a family of billionaires who made their money in cane sugar in America when they came here from Cuba in, I think, the 1950s. I think they were growing sugar in Cuba before. But sugar is something that grows really well in the tropics, and America is not a tropical country. We've got a few places where you can grow sugar pretty well, but not a lot. But we also have these import quotas, and what that means is that these very small number of places that do grow sugar face less competition from Caribbean sugar. So if you're a sugar farmer in Florida, this sugar quota means that as much sugar as I as a consumer want to import from cheap places like, Haiti or Dominican Republic or wherever else, I'd like to import a lot, but I'm legally not allowed to. So once I import all that cheap sugar, now I got to pay higher prices to get American sugar. And the result is the cost of cane sugar in America is about twice the world price. Here's the thing though. Small number of sugar farmers, large number of sugar buyers. So for consumers, this means about $10 per person per year. That's a small enough figure that you don't even notice it. And you're certainly not willing to do very much about it. Right? So you are losing, right? But that $10 that you lose per year, maybe $5 of that ends up in the hands of a sugar farmer. Right? And this isn't like, the American Gothic, some hard-scrabble individualist American sugar farm family. Right? This is billionaires. These are rich people. So I lose $10, some billionaire gains $5. It's economically inefficient. But what am I going to do about it, and what are they going to do about it? At $10 a person, I'm not willing to do much. At $1 million per person, a sugar farmer is willing to do a lot. So this is a case where voters are rationally ignorant because the costs of being informed, right, are positive, right? You have to learn anything at all. And what can you do about it? Not much. Maybe you write a letter to your congressperson. Now, what's the value of your time? If your time is worth $10 an hour, you do this, you spend an hour, you send off this letter. What's the chance that we get rid of the protectionism? It's pretty small. So you spend an hour and you have zero outcome. Now instead of $10 loss, you get $20 loss. Right? You're not willing to do anything about this. It's hard to organize 300 million American consumers. Now we might expect the candy companies to do something, and surely they have some lobbyists preventing this problem from being even worse. Right? But you and I, it's just not worth our time. Right? We just suffer through it. We're just going to keep losing this $10 every year, and a lot of it's going to be wasted, and some of it is going to end up making someone richer. Now, the people in the sugar industry, they are going to be rationally informed because it's a lot of money to them. Even if you're not the billionaire who owns the company, you're just the guy making $50,000 a year driving the tractor, you still might have some idea of which political candidate is going to support your special interests. So you're going to be better able to organize to support these inefficient policies when you're a beneficiary because you're getting a bigger slice, right? But the big thing here is we concentrate the benefits, right? So the sugar farmer gets a big slice of this prize, but we spread the costs thin. Consumers pay a small slice. And so we have an asymmetry in incentives. Sugar farmers have stronger incentive to organize, and there's a smaller number of them, so they're going to have an easier time putting together some sort of a trade organization to hire lobbyists to support this protectionist policy. Sugar consumers, we're spread thin, and we've got other things to do. And to save $10 a year, how much effort are we willing to put in given a low chance of success? Not very much. Right? The sugar farmers have an unfair advantage here. And as a result, we're probably going to have these sugar import quotas for as long as you and I live, right? Unless something changes, maybe voters just get it into their heads, right? They just learn about this and they decide that this matters, right? Maybe a politician figures out they can get votes by getting rid of this. But probably not, right? Because we have this asymmetry that creates a sort of a stable situation. Now, another side of this, what sort of regulations might we expect to see? Right? So we saw one with the sugar regulations where their ability to organize and hire lobbyists was greater than the people on the other side of some issue. Sometimes we have two people on the side of an issue who are actually able to get together. Right? This is where politics gets the phrase, politics makes strange bedfellows. So B&B here stands for bootleggers and Baptists. So let's go back in time 100 years, and we think about the issue of alcohol prohibition. And of course, the same argument has been happening ever since then in various forms for various other sorts of drug prohibitions. Still happening for meth and cocaine and opiates and all these things. It's starting to fall away for cannabis. It has fallen away mostly for alcohol. But let's tell the old story because it's a little bit easier to kind of wrap our heads around. So who gains and who loses with alcohol prohibition? What are the reasons that we might support alcohol prohibitions, and what are some of the reasons that we might support alcohol prohibition that maybe we wouldn't want to admit in public? All right, so who loses? Well, alcohol consumers lose, alcohol producers lose, teetotalers gain. But there's also another group that gains, and that group is bootleggers, people who sell illegal alcohol would like to have less competition from legal producers. This actually came up, I believe it was 2010, when I was an undergrad living in California. They had a bill to legalize recreational cannabis, and one of the groups coming against it were the illegal growers in Humboldt County. They came out and said, look, if pot gets legalized, we're going to have to compete with the growers in the valley. The California Valley is this massively productive area of agriculture. They steal a whole bunch of water from the Colorado River and they grow a bunch of stuff in what would otherwise be desert. They got a ton of sunshine. They would just be able to grow way, way, way more product in a place where they're not growing out in the open. Where they're not growing in the woods, right, hiding it. Humboldt growers, they had a comparative advantage in secretly growing cannabis. So when you take away the need to secretly grow, they would be at a big competitive disadvantage in a legal market, right? Likewise, alcohol bootleggers, they would like to be able to sell their alcohol, their moonshine, at a higher price. They aren't going to be able to do that if anyone can go to any drugstore or corner store, liquor store, 7-Eleven and just buy alcohol. The harder it is to buy alcohol, the higher the demand and therefore the higher the price for illegal alcohol. Now the public-spirited reasons, that gives us our selfish reasons for supporting prohibition, but our public-spirited reasons were from the teetotalers, or the Baptists in this case, making totally reasonable arguments like alcohol causes a lot of problems. People get drunk and they crash their cars. People get drunk and they beat their wives and kids. They don't go to work. They're inefficient. There's all kinds of bad things, all kinds of costs that we get from alcohol. And those are some good reasons to support alcohol prohibition. Now, as an economist, I'm going to tell you right off the bat, alcohol prohibition is a terrible idea. Alcohol prohibition basically gave us organized crime. Right? There was small-scale organized crime for gambling, which, again, maybe should have been legal to begin with. But having alcohol prohibition is a terrible idea. But the bootleggers and Baptists can get together and they can argue for alcohol prohibition. The Baptists will be the public-facing side of this. They'll come out and they'll say, here are all the problems alcohol causes. The bootleggers will be in the background funding the Baptists, making charitable donations to make sure that the Baptists can be as effective as possible at engaging in this rent-seeking, right? They don't know they're rent-seeking, but they're rent-seeking for the Baptists in this case, right? Other versions of this aren't necessarily just alcohol, right? But we might also have bootleggers and Baptists in things like environmental issues. So Bruce Yandel, who dubbed this term the bootleggers and Baptist theory of regulation, was giving the example of regulations in the 1970s to deal with acid rain. So there was a lot of coal pollution. There was absolutely externalities that something should have been done about. In this case, the environmentalists were the Baptists arguing we need to help the environment, we need to stop acid rain. The acid rain is causing problems for agriculture, for just quality of life. It's a big deal. We need to do something about it. They had the public-spirited arguments. Totally valid, totally worth supporting. The bootlegger side of this is that the particular sorts of regulations that get selected may be better or worse for existing vested interests. So when you think about the issue of coal, you might do something like outlaw coal entirely. You might put filters on the smokestacks, or you might go from high sulfur coal from West Virginia to low sulfur coal from Utah. Now, we've been mining high sulfur coal in West Virginia for a long time. Pennsylvania, that whole part of the world, makes some real nasty coal, but the industry's already there. So in the 70s, their lobbyists were successful at imposing a regulation that was good for the environment, but wasn't necessarily the best way to get the economic benefits. They got filter requirements put in place that reduced the benefit of switching to cleaner coal from alternate sources, right? That also reduced the benefit of switching to cleaner fuels like natural gas. So we had the Baptists arguing we need to do something, and the bootleggers arguing for we need to do this, because this hurts my competitors more than it hurts me, and the result is we can be more profitable. A more recent example, one that might strike home more with you all, is Facebook and privacy issues, right? Facebook, WhatsApp, all of them. They're going to go down to Washington, D.C., and they're going to argue that if you want to have a social media website, you should have a ton of lawyers and oversight and all of this infrastructure in place to do a good job. Facebook started with a guy in a dorm room, right? It wouldn't have worked if Zuckerberg had to start by hiring a team of lawyers before he started to build his product. If that was the case, we might still be using MySpace or Friendster or some pre-Facebook social media today. If the new guy, whatever might replace Facebook, if they can't get off the ground because they need investors to hire the lawyers and the compliance officers and all these other things before they even get started, in a case like that, regulation that's costly to Facebook might be in Facebook's interest because it's more costly to their potential competitors. And the result is social media industry will be less competitive. You and I will have less options. All right, big story. The logic of collective action really boils down to there are winners and losers with any sort of political action. And when the winners are a small group and the losers are a large group, that large group is at a disadvantage because the costs are spread so thin. Right? Overall, rent seeking, it destroys wealth, right? But it's not like we all are 5% poorer. It's most of us are 10% poorer. Some people are 100% richer, right? It's a non-uniform change in wealth. Right? There's winners and losers. When the winners are a small group of people, think about this, right? Think about the last time you tried to go to lunch with 5 people. And think about how much more difficult that was than trying to go to lunch on your own. If you want to go to lunch, you just go to where you want to go. If you want to get a group of people to go to lunch, you have to decide, you have to organize, you have to debate, right? And it's a pain, and it makes it difficult to go to lunch with more than a small group of people. So if the winners of some policy are already a small group of people, they are going to be better able to get together to cooperate and to do things like hire lobbyists, right? There's going to be less of a free rider problem. And there's going to be stronger incentives because they're each going to get a bigger share of the gains. Right? So let's imagine something that affects everyone in, let's say, Long Island. I think it's what, 1.5 million people. Let's call it 1 million people just for a round number. So we have something, let's say, takes $1 away from every adult on Long Island. Right? We each lose $1. That's $1 million sitting in a pile somewhere. Even if we burn half of it, right? Let's say we have 5 people who get $100,000 each out of this policy, right? So the losses are $1 million, the gains are $500,000. From society's perspective, we have destroyed $500,000 of well-being. We're destroying value, we're making society poorer. But those 5 people getting $100,000 each, how much effort do you think they're going to put into this? Right? I know that if I buy something on Amazon for $10 and I decide I don't want it, that's not even worth returning it for me, right? I'd rather just throw it out. But for $100,000, you better believe I'm going to deal with it, right? So if I'm one of these 5 people getting $100,000, that's worth putting in as much effort as I put into my job for a year and then some, right? So when we have a small group of winners from some inefficient policy, they're going to work hard to keep this inefficient policy. But the losers, when they're a small group and the losses are spread thin, first off, how much are you and I willing to do to avoid a $1 loss? Not much. Second, how much are we going to be able to organize 1 million people in order to oppose this policy? We're not going to be able to do very much at all, right? It's going to be just random luck of the draw. So given that, we're going to see rent-seeking as more likely to succeed. We're going to see more of the sorts of policies that create costs that are spread thin and create benefits that are concentrated on a small group, even if the costs outweigh those benefits. We're also likely to see these bootleggers and Baptist situations where you have public arguments in favor of these inefficient policies, but you have some private gain to some group who is then willing to invest in rent-seeking for these inefficient policies. All right, now a little insight into how people like me make decisions. What do bureaucrats do? So let's take a step back. If you're in a micro class, we've spent a bunch of time on subsidies. If you're in a macro class and you haven't done subsidies yet, check my YouTube page. I've got some videos to walk through this. But the short version is a subsidy is like a negative tax, and it gets people to do too much of something. Right? It gets us to a situation where we're buying more units than we would in equilibrium, and the marginal cost of the last unit is greater than the marginal benefit of the last unit. Right? So we're getting dead weight loss because the costs exceed the benefits to these units that we're only buying because of the subsidy. So you think about something like, well, let's say solar panel. Let's assume away the environmental aspect of solar panels for a second. Right? Solar panels have subsidies. Solar panels have benefits, so people will buy them. Right? There is some demand for them. They also have some costs, so there's going to be a supply curve that limits how much solar panels are available. But if we add a subsidy, now people are going to be willing to buy them who weren't willing to buy them otherwise because the government's picking up part of the tab. Right? You spend 10 grand on the solar panels, but you pay less out of pocket because you save 4,000 bucks on your taxes. So even though it's a $10,000 solar panel, if you're only paying $6,000, you're happy with that deal if it's giving you $7,000 worth of power. Right? But if it's costing $10,000 and it's giving $7,000 worth of power, it doesn't matter that you only pay $6,000 for it. From society's perspective, it's a dead weight loss. Right? So the TLDR of subsidies is it gets us to do too much of a good thing. Right? It gets us to buy units where the benefits are more than offset by costs. With bureaucrats want good things, right? In the same way with subsidized stuff, we're dealing with something that has some benefit. It is a good thing. Bureaucrats have some mission, right? So I think economics is incredibly important, and my department should get extra funding because of that. Someone who works at the EPA thinks the environment is incredibly important, right? People working for a bureaucracy, they're very often driven by some mission, right? So they want to advance that mission, and that's great. They also want, power and prestige and the things that everyone wants in some setting. Economists looking at this issue, public choice theorists, kind of simplify this down to economic agents, right? You and me, consumers, we try to maximize utility. Companies try to maximize profits. Bureaucrats try to maximize their budget. So if I am the head of a large bureaucracy, I have more opportunities. I have more prestige. I have more ability to advance my mission. I have all the things that I want. So as a bureaucrat, I want to grow the size of my budget, even if that means growing it past the point where the costs to society outweigh the benefits to society. So superiors want more subordinates. The subordinates, they want more funding. Bureaucrats, they just want a bigger budget, right? That's sort of what it boils down to. Now, the problem with this is that we get that same problems with subsidy. We get too much of a good thing. Right? Now, one aspect is we move beyond diminishing marginal returns, and we can go into the realm of doing more harm than good, right? In particular, when we look at the benefits some bureaucracy does, but we ignore the costs, right? If this is taxpayer funded, we're ignoring what else might we have bought with those dollars. So the EPA gets us a cleaner environment, but maybe we have less money available to deal with poverty, right? The result might be that an extra $1 billion for the EPA makes the environment this much cleaner, but it increases the problem of poverty by a larger amount. We also have this problem of a new special interest group, right? So yeah, economics is important. Higher ed can do all kinds of valuable things. Higher ed, it's a nice enough industry. It was certainly a sensible sounding idea when higher ed started to get big subsidies from the American government in the 50s with the GI Bill. But now we also have to worry about special interest groups, and special interest groups, as we've seen, can lead to inefficient outcomes, right? To say nothing of making it more difficult for the industry to adapt, right? So we got all kinds of weird incentive problems. And we also have this knowledge problem. Remember back from talking about prices, what they do in the context of supply and demand, they tell us about relative scarcity. When we move something from a market into a bureaucracy, we lose the price mechanism. We lose the signals that we get from the price about the relative benefits of some good relative to the opportunity costs of the inputs to that good. Now again, this is a micro thing when we think about externalities. We get some caveats there, right? So take Eco 157, take your intermediate micro. But long story short, we lose the prices, and if those prices were more or less accurate, right? If we were capturing things like the costs of pollution and other externalities, those prices are the best source of information for making rational decisions about marginal benefits and costs, about navigating trade-offs. When you move something into a bureaucracy, we lose those prices. Now that's not to say that we never want to use bureaucracies, right? Sometimes we want to use bureaucracies in particular settings. Sometimes even within a market context, we want bureaucratic rules just to make life easier in some particular aspect of that market setting. But when we don't have a price, we can't say what maximizes profit. Instead, we just have to set up a set of rules to guide our behavior. Right? So how do resources get used within a university? Well, it's not a question of where can they do the most good for the bottom line of the school. Right? It's going to be a matter of putting in requisition forms, of following rules, of creating rules, of manipulating those rules to benefit my department more than some other department. Right? We run into this whole different way of making decisions, and that leads to sometimes really irrational looking outcomes. Right? We really see the bureaucratic rules when they break down. What's the alternative? Well, the alternative is either we move back to a market situation, or we don't have these bureaucratic rules, and then we just have incredible inefficiency. Right? The rules are an important part of making a bureaucratic system work. So if we've got something like, say, your local police, we probably want your local police under current circumstances to be a bureaucracy and not a for-profit thing. Right? For something like hiring extra security guards for events, the market works pretty well. Maybe it could work for police, right? But that's a big question. But if we're thinking about as things are right now, well, we've already got the police organized as a bureaucracy. So we want to do things like, say, have rules about use of force, or when can you tase someone, or when can you arrest someone. We have these bureaucratic rules that outline what police can do to achieve their job, or what can a loan officer within a large bank do to allocate loan money, right? That's bureaucratic rules within a for-profit situation, right? But long story short, when we have bureaucratic organization, we're going to need rules. When we have rules, we might have better or worse rules, but we're always going to have some situations where the rules lead to some sort of an ugly outcome. Certainly we've seen this with the recent pandemic, where we've got a bunch of money in some account, but we're not allowed to use it for things like, say, buying masks or whatever, right? There might be something that we want to do, and we know that we got money here, but the bureaucratic rules get in the way. That's a cost of having those bureaucratic rules, right? And that relates to our knowledge problem. Now, we also have the broader problem of when we have bureaucrats making these decisions, they're making these decisions without prices, right? When they're making decisions about, say, what rules to place about how do you interact with an endangered species, they're dealing with situations where we don't have prices, right? So they are fundamentally groping in the dark in terms of making trade-offs about relative costs and benefits. All right, let's close this section with a nice little piece from Catch-22. Catch-22 is a really fun book that really illustrates some of the absurd irrationalities that can happen in a bureaucratic setting. So this is all a quote. I forget the page number, but search Google Books. Colonel Scheisskopf was all ears. What are bomb patterns? Bomb patterns, General Peckham repeated, twinkling with self-satisfied good humor. A bomb pattern is a term I dreamed up just several weeks ago. It means nothing, but you'd be surprised at how rapidly it's caught on. Why, I've got all sorts of people convinced I think it's important for the bombs to explode close together and make a neat aerial photograph. There's one colonel in Pianosa who's hardly concerned anymore with whether he hits a target or not. Sorry for that typo. When we see this sort of stuff, oh, I hope I didn't lose all the way to the beginning. When we see regulations put in place, we end up with these rules, and often the people acting within a bureaucratic scenario, within a bureaucratic organization, they do things to try and advance where they are within that regulation. They try to play the game within the regulation, and that might be something that goes directly against what the overall organization is trying to achieve, right? We see this in all kinds of unsettling ways in higher ed sometimes, but here, this is a fictional example, but here we've got this bureaucratic thing that makes General Peckham's job a little bit easier in evaluating his colonels, but it leads his colonels to do worse things in terms of the war effort. All right, so what have we seen with public choice theory? We've seen a lot of things, and we've only seen a small slice of it. Public choice theory is a really big field. There are a ton of things. Right, so here I've got a textbook, Public Choice 3. This is almost pretty overdue for an update by now. This is 2009, the 9th printing. Copyright 2003. And public choice theorists have certainly been doing a lot more since then. It's a big, big field. There's a lot to learn. And there's a lot of really interesting things that have a lot of interesting and important implications for a lot of the big problems that we face. Some of them are straightforwardly political problems, but we also have these broader problems like good governance. Good governance is involved in things like operating a nonprofit or making a open source software program work with collaboration from people. It's certainly important in making government work, but we learn stuff about good governance by thinking about things like the prisoner's dilemma, by thinking about how people in a particular context perceive their options and which options they see as most attractive. The economic way of thinking, in a nutshell, isn't just about dollars and cents. It's also about making decisions in these non-market settings. Now, very importantly, market failure is something that we might be able to address, but the solutions to market failure have the same logic underneath the market failure itself. Right? There's no free lunch in solving the world's problems. So we think about the free rider problem involved in, say, overcoming the problem of funding an asteroid defense program. Right? right? So we find out an asteroid's headed towards Earth. It's going to kill us all in a year. What do we do about it? We knock on doors and try and raise money. Maybe we can pay for it this way, but we're kind of working uphill with the free rider problem. So what do? Maybe we decide to organize a government to force people to pay for this, but that government itself is still a public good, right? So we want to provide a public good. We want the government to provide the public good because we have a hard time doing it privately, but getting a good government is itself a public good, and we only get that through the private action of individuals doing things like irrationally deciding to be informed. Put another way, there's no easy answers to the problems that we have in the world. We're certainly not going to do anything without learning more, right? Without trying to understand those problems, which is why we study economics. But I also don't have an easy answer of we just do this and problem solved. Very important takeaway, more specific to this lecture, rent seeking reduces efficiency. Something that's good for my industry is probably bad for society overall. And every industry has their set of things that they want to do, and when we all do this, we all end up poorer as a result. Concentrated benefits, dispersed costs. This is the sort of setting that's going to allow an inefficient policy to take root. Bootleggers and Baptists, that sort of a scenario is going to make it even worse. And overall, the really big problem we want to think about, that we want to worry about, is that it's not just here's a problem, let's solve it. It's here's a system that creates the problem. We address the symptoms without addressing the system. We're just going to change the nature of the problem. We want to solve these problems, so we need to think about the system as a whole, right? In the case of, say, rent seeking, this involves things like maybe passing a constitutional amendment to restrict politicians' abilities to enrich some industries at the expense of other industries. And I should say, if you are still with me at this point, in Blackboard you can find the link to the presentation, and you will find all kinds of helpful notes for individual slides and little stories and things like that that didn't make it into this. Off the top of my head, I can't remember what this one is. Check it out when you get a chance. But the TLDR, the big story overall, good politics does not make good economics. Right? The reason we see inefficient economic policies done in political settings is because the costs and benefits facing political actors is not capturing all of the costs and benefits involved. So a politician might get voted into office by passing good policies, but if there's another politician who can get 51% of the vote by saying something like, let's murder 40% of the population and give their stuff to everyone else, right? It's a terrible policy idea. But if it's going to get votes, then that is going to sway the nature of political competition. What the rules of the game are in political competition are going to determine what policies happen, but those rules of the game often lead us away from the basic rules of economics. All right, so that's a lot of stuff, and like I said, that's only a small selection. So I hope you will bring this over to the class Discord, ask in the usual places, and as usual, I will see you in the future. Adios.